So this absolute mad lad here is heir to the English throne, Edward the Black Prince, who was an absolute menace to the French, which was in full display during his Grand Chevauchee in 1355, inflicting devastating damage to the French economy. In early 1355, peace talks between England and France broke down over who was the rightful king of France, and now it was game on again for the lads, and one man who had been pissing off the English during the past year's truce was John the Count of Armagnac, who had been attacking English-held lands in Gascony. The Black Prince was made Lieutenant of Gascony by his father, King Edward III, giving him full permission to act as if the king was there himself, and that he did by launching a devastating chevauchee into the Count of Armagnac's lands with 5,000 men in early October. While the word chevauchee literally means a ride on horseback, in the 14th century world this was an absolutely savage raid of pillaging, plundering and burning anything they could find, with the inhabitants' only crime being that they chose the wrong overlord and it was showing that their lord was incapable of protecting them. The Black Prince now marched east into the Count of Armagnac's lands, burning and looting any town they could find. However, the Count was nowhere to be seen, opting for a more defensive strategy and avoiding open battle, and King John II of France wasn't happy with the Count's strategy, so he sent him more troops, and they now outnumbered the English, but the Count was still like, we're not facing them in open battle because the troops you have sent me are absolutely piss poor. French forces had holed up in the fortified city of Toulouse and broken every river crossing for miles around, expecting the Black Prince just to turn back around and go home. However, he knew of another crossing further upstream that was extremely dangerous, however the rewards for crossing it would be immense. The audacity of the prince to cross the river took the French completely off guard, and now the prince, despite losing some men and supplies in the crossing, had access to one of the richest agricultural regions in France that was totally unprepared for war, and it gave his troops a massive morale boost. The unopposed English force were inflicting devastating damage to the French economy, with local populations terrified that they could be next, fortifying their towns as best as possible, and directing extreme anger at the Count of Armagnac due to his lack of action. The Pope in Avignon was watching the Black Prince's progress with great alarm, and now sent messengers to the raiding party for the truce between France and England to be reinstated. However, the Prince just responded, "If you want peace, go to the King of England himself, and we will do as he commands." The Prince's army did encounter some minor resistance at Narbonne, where they decided to turn home in mid-November, and they did expect an engagement to happen with the French on the way back home, but this never came as they were still camped out in Toulouse. What would eventually become known as the Grand Chevauchee lasted just under 2 months, and while no territory was captured, it inflicted devastating economic damage on the southern region of France, with one account stating that English soldiers had to get rid of some silver just to carry all the gold and jewellery they had looted. With how much fun and success the Black Prince had on this chevauchee, he decided to launch one in the next year, which did eventually draw the French into battle. So after absolutely decimating the French economy in his savage Grand Chevauchee of 1355, the Black Prince was once again at it less than a year later, as England was preparing one of the most ambitious military campaigns of the medieval world as they looked to press their advantage in the war and stake their claim to the French crown. They would coordinate assaults on the French from 3 directions in order to draw King John II of France into a decisive battle and defeat him. King Edward III of England would land his forces either in Normandy or Calais and meet with another English force led by Henry of Grosmont, the Duke of Lancaster, landing in the other location, all while the Black Prince and his forces came up from their lands in Gascony in order to try and force King John II of France into open battle somewhere around Paris. However, the political situation in France was changing daily, as in April 1356 the King of Navarre, Charles II, one of the largest landowners in France, was arrested for treason by the French king. Sensing an opportunity, Edward now sent the Duke of Lancaster's forces to the towns in Normandy loyal to Charles II, who were in open rebellion against the French. However, the English were soon chased off by an outnumbering French force led by John II himself, but not before inflicting devastating economic damage in their own chevauchee. The Black Prince's expedition set off in early August with around 6,000 men. However, by this time the Duke of Lancaster's forces had disbanded. Edward now didn't intend to cross the Channel due to a blockade from the French, and his three-pronged invasion was over before it had even begun. The Black Prince, though, was entirely unaware of these developments and set off on his chevauchee as per his original plan, inflicting devastating economic damage, burning and raiding all across French lands, but he soon realised something was seriously wrong as the French Dauphin, his original target in the Count of Poitiers, retreated his army to the River Loire. Almost a month into the Black Prince's campaign, he now found out the devastating news that his father hadn't crossed the Channel, the campaign in Normandy was over, and the French were amassing a hefty force with thousands joining every day for a chance to strike at the Black Prince for what he had done a year prior in his absolutely savage Chevauchee. The Prince now marched west in an attempt to join with the remnants of Lancaster's forces, who had been told by the King to aid the Prince any way he could, where the Prince first besieged the castle of Romorantin and took it, which provided a much needed morale boost for his troops. News of how fast Lancaster's forces were approaching the Prince's provided much excitement for them, and although if they joined the armies they would still be outnumbered by the French, they could claim victory through the superior quality of their troops. However, whatever excitement they now had, it was soon dashed by the weather. Heavy rain swelled the Loire River, which made any crossing around here impossible for the English, which was the only way they could combine forces, and now the Prince heard the devastating news that thousands of Frenchmen were on the march, chasing his army, and he soon ordered a retreat south. The Prince now knew a battle was all but inevitable, as the French had overtaken them on their march south, and he tried to take them off guard first at a bridge at Chavignon. However, most of them had already crossed over to the town of Poitiers, but a few were left behind, and they killed or captured around 200 French knights. There was now nowhere to run for the Prince, and one of the most decisive battles of the Middle Ages was about to happen. So on the 19th of September 1356, a massively outnumbered English force led by heir to the throne, Edward the Black Prince, lined up against the French army led by the King himself in what would be one of the most decisive battles of the Middle Ages. The entire Anglo-Gascon army was around 5,000 to 6,000 men entirely dismounted, with half being longbowmen placed on the flanks and the rest men-at-arms in the centre, which were roughly 5 ranks deep, and their flanks were protected by this thick forest here and the embankment over here, and they arrayed roughly 750 metres across a ridge. Baggage trains were used to shield the army further, with the men being placed in thick hedges of thorns and dug ditches to prevent any sudden cavalry attacks. The French army led by King John II consisted of around 15,000 men, 10,000 heavily armoured men-at-arms, 3,000 crossbowmen and 2,000 more infantry, and they approached the English position on September the 18th. Upon inspecting the English defensive position, they decided to fight entirely dismounted, except for a few hundred cavalry who would be placed on the flanks to break open the English archers, and they would be formed in 3 divisions, the first led by the King's oldest son, the second by his brother, and the third by the King himself. A short truce which neither side wanted was agreed upon, as churchmen rode onto the battlefield in an attempt to stop the clash. However, the French were confident of victory, and the English didn't want to delay any further and were wary that any meaningful terms would actually be offered, as they were about to be annihilated. But it was a Sunday and a holy day, and a short truce was agreed. The negotiations couldn't have been too serious, as King John demanded that Edward give up all lands in France, release any prisoners without ransom, as well as not attack him for 7 years, and the Prince, not to be outdone, asked for the King's daughter hand in marriage, as well as a substantial dowry. The truce held the entire day, and with both armies less than a mile apart, soldiers came face to face, watering their horses in the same stream, with one Frenchman reportedly unhappy at an Englishman because their heraldry was too similar, and he claimed that England never invented anything good and just stole everything they could. Both armies camped the night in their battle locations, and on the morning of September the 19th, 1356, at around 7:30 am, the Black Prince made the first move in order to provoke the French into attacking, as he couldn't just stand there idly looking into his lover's eyes as his men were about to starve to death. The Prince's force began to move in a southerly direction as if they were retreating, a clever feint which the French inevitably fell for, and the battle cries went up and the cavalry began to charge, with the English scrambling back to their original positions and bracing for impact. Cavalry supported by crossbowmen absolutely clattered into the English lines, and an all-out brawl broke out between them, men-at-arms and longbowmen, and the thin English line did show signs of buckling, with more cavalry joining in the mosh pit, and with infantry fast approaching, it seemed the Prince needed a miracle to save him. Began by clattering into the English lines. However, the English longbows, known for their devastating effect, had little impact on the French cavalry charge, as their horses had horse armour. However, they soon managed to shift their position, and now they could fire their arrows into the horses' rears, who kicked up in agony, throwing their riders onto the ground, and the English men-at-arms made short work of the French cavalry, and the longbows could now focus on the advancing infantry and the crossbows which had supported the cavalry charge. The longbows rained down arrows on the advancing French infantry, however they continued on to the English line, and the battle now turned into a lethal slugging match as every man was a possessed beast trying to kill the man in front of him so that he may live for a few minutes longer. Over the next 3 hours, men were ruthlessly slaughtered as the English line was on the verge of collapse numerous times, with the Prince having to commit almost all of his reserve and English commanders showing great tactical flexibility to redirect their troops in the heat of battle to respond to new threats, as if Pep Guardiola was leading them himself. The first 2 French lines which had been committed into the battle were now beginning to pull back as the English line howled. However, they were exhausted with broken weapons and literally had no longbow arrows left, so they had to scavenge whatever they could off the dead men lying across the battlefield, as they looked on in horror at the oncoming French 3rd Division, which was now growing larger with all the men who had fallen back. This new conglomerate of French forces, who are now the powerhouse of the battlefield, outnumbered the remaining Anglo-Gascon force in its entirety, and King John II now unfurled the Oriflamme banner, meaning no surrender, no prisoners were to be taken, and no mercy was to be shown. As the exhausted English force looked on to see this massive 3rd French division marching towards them, cries went up that they should flee before they were overwhelmed, and captains tried hard to steady their men, and the Black Prince had one last throw of the dice left. The Prince ordered any man of a horse left to mount up, and a small force of 60 mounted men and 100 archers was led round the flank of the French, which they couldn't see as it was covered by a ridgeline. All while by some accounts, English knight James Audley was preparing to lead a direct suicide mission at the French king with himself and 4 other mounted men. The courage of Audley's charge galvanised what was left of the English force as fear dissolved, and as Gascon Lord de Grailly's banners appeared over the hillside, Edward sounded the charge as Audley began to pick up pace. Arrows began to rain in on the French as the English advanced, and they were so focused on the frontal attack by the English, they didn't notice 60 cavalry about to charge their flanks, as well as 100 archers ready to unleash arrows on them. Confusion and panic now set in amongst the French ranks as they didn't know who this was or where it came from, and cries of betrayal went up, and the French quickly turned and fled as the king and his personal bodyguard were now surrounded. However, they didn't surrender, cutting down any Englishmen who came near them. The king's 3 oldest sons were dragged off the battlefield earlier, however his youngest at 14 years old was still with him, calling out to his father every direction the enemy came in. The king was soon captured, and this so-called great and terrible battle was now over, with reports stating around 7,000 French captured or killed, with English numbers unaccounted for. James Audley, who had the courage to lead the suicide mission himself on the king, was found wounded, lying under a bush, and was nursed back to health by the prince himself. The Black Prince now had a prisoner who was worth his weight in gold, and he was soon ransomed back to the French for around 3 million gold crowns, as well as around a third of the lands in France to be held in full sovereignty by the English.